Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scrap Mechanic. I've got a pretty fun one today, inspired by a tangent in a previous video where I mentioned the electromagnet mod. Lilia commented and asked if I could make a magnetic railgun. I thought that sounded like fun, and though I did some other stuff first, as soon as I read this I knew I had to make one. To start, if you don't know what a railgun is, it's basically a gun made out of a rail. Now onto the video. Just kidding. A railgun is actually just two rails with electricity running along their length. When a projectile bridges these two rails, an electromagnetic force, caused by some complicated math, propels the projectile down the rail. I'll link a great video by Electroboom where he builds one if you care about the math. What I think this comment actually wanted, and what I think will be more fun to build, is a coil gun, a type of launcher often confused for a railgun. A coil gun uses a series of electromagnets along the length of a barrel that are each turned on in time with a projectile to pull and or push it out of the barrel. For the sake of the video, I will probably call it a railgun throughout, but know that it isn't actually a railgun. I started this build by experimenting with the electromagnet mod to make sure it was consistent and that it would do what I needed it to do. The electromagnets in this mod look like red logic blocks and can be toggled between a north pole, south pole, or a general magnetic mode that's always attracted regardless of polarity. If you hook them up to a button, they're set to full power constantly, but you can also connect them to an engine and then you can vary the strength according to the setting on the engine's interface. In this video, all of the magnets will be in normal magnet mode, because there isn't an easy way to vary the poles without clicking on each one. I tested their consistency and strength by placing a single magnet inside of a cube of metal and seeing how it behaved around a 4x4 grid of magnets. You can see that it kind of just acted heavier, which was perfect and exactly what I was hoping for. I also learned through this that the magnets are far more consistent if you don't let them actually touch each other, by having at least one block between them. And it's gone. Otherwise, the forces are too strong and they stop listening to what physics has to say. I then moved this 4x4 of magnets into the air to see how much strength it took on the engine to lift a slightly larger cube. I did this because I wanted to get a better understanding of what the strength settings actually meant. I also learned here, though, that the magnets work even on the lift, something that turns out to be incredibly useful for testing later on. I also tried here to vary the poles to see if it would be possible to make an alternating magnet, but I decided it would just get too complicated. With a better understanding in hand, I set out to make the first prototype. I built the barrel primarily out of mesh blocks because their low friction would mean a projectile could move faster. I made it a 4-wide channel with 2 high walls on each side. My idea was that instead of programming each set of magnets, I would place a sensor down that would pull the magnet forward whenever it was detected in the correct location. To do this, I placed a sensor down followed by some magnets. This would just be a repeating pattern down the length of the barrel. I wired up the first set of magnets and gave it a test. I put down a 4x4 cube with magnets inside and hit it with my hammer. That actually worked like so much better than I expected it to. It seemed to work pretty well, but I wasn't sure if my hammer did it all or if the magnets actually helped. To see for sure, I wired up the remaining sensors and tried it again, this time dropping it over the sensor so I didn't have to hit it. It flew really far considering its weight, so I knew it was onto something. Next I had to refine this design and see what the limitations were. Of course, the easiest way to do that is to duplicate it on my lift a couple times and see how long I can make it and still launch the projectile. I welded a total of 9 segments and tested again. It was definitely still working, but it didn't seem much faster than before, and it wasn't going as fast as I wanted. So I rebuilt this design, but instead of using just 2 magnets on either side of the barrel, I put 6 magnets across the floor as well, for a total of 10 magnets per segment. I welded 4 of these together and gave it a try with the same projectile as I did before. And it barely worked at all. Who knew, more magnets doesn't fix every issue. The issue with this new design is that there's now 6 magnets in the floor and nothing pulling up. So the projectile just got pulled straight into the floor and tumbled out of the end. I tried to fix this tumbling by adding a covering to make the barrel partially enclosed to prevent rotation. I forgot to consider that welding a projectile on would now also weld to the cover, but after fixing that you can see this design looked more promising. The projectile was launched perfectly in a line and didn't seem to get caught on the tube like I expected. To iterate on this design further, I tried to add even more magnets by making it a full loop, because you know, more magnets fixed my issues last time. I tested a single segment of this design and it seemed to perform better than any had designed before, launching the projectile out with quite a bit of speed after only a single segment. I then, of course, welded a few of these together to see how much more power I could create. This is when I started to have collision issues. You can see that, after welding a number of these designs together, the projectile just falls out of the end of the barrel instead of being launched. This is because it collides inside the tube and loses all of its energy. I probably could have just cut this in half to where it worked and called that a railgun, but I really wanted something much longer and more reminiscent of a real-life railgun, something with more segments that accelerated the projectile over a longer period of time. Before giving up, though, I tried to resolve the collision issues by making something more like a magnetic ball than a cube. Scrap Mechanic doesn't really have a way I can create custom spherical objects, so I rounded the corners of my box and tried that. Oh. It immediately got stuck. I really tried to get this to work, including putting holes in the side of the barrel to reduce friction, but at the end of the day, it had enough tolerance that it could get stuck, but not enough space to get unstuck. If I could create a true sphere, I don't think this would be an issue, but I'm working with what I have. After realizing that for sure wasn't going to work, I tried something a little different. I placed down a 2 tall cube of magnets and surrounded it by the best block in the game, screws. I know this looks weird, but my thinking was that the barrel was a 4x4 internal tube, so I needed something that fit in there with some tolerance, and screws are less than a full block, so I thought they were perfect. Also, this is a good time to mention how I get the magnets to be active all the time, even without a switch. I actually place a sensor down that faces into the creation, so it will always be active. Then I wire that up to the magnets so they're all permanently on. After adjusting the sensors, this actually ended up being my best projectile by far because of its low mass and high tolerance. Whoa, okay. It went so far that it was actually out of my render distance, and I couldn't find it, so I had to build another one for testing. I actually also built another launcher prototype here because, as I said, I wasn't happy with the last one, and this one had no magnets on the top or the bottom. I put the screwball in the launcher to test, and as soon as I dropped it, it was gone. Again, out of my render distance. As well as this worked, at this point I remembered I wanted to make an explosive projectile, and that wouldn't be possible in this format. The screw projectile was also really difficult to work with because you can't weld the screws, so I ditched it for another projectile and went back to testing with the bigger cube. In the meantime, I also decided that I wanted to make the launcher part out of engine-controlled magnets. If you recall, a magnet connected to an engine has a much finer strength control, so I placed an engine down on a segment, connected it to the magnets, and duplicated it a couple times. That seemed to work without much issue, but I wasn't done testing. I cut the top off to reduce collisions, and that has the bonus of being able to see the projectile launch through. I also messed with making the barrel longer and shorter, adding another cover, and I spent a ton of time messing with engine speeds to see if there was an optimal setup that improved consistency. After getting that as good as it was going to get, I moved on to making the projectile. I had another idea similar to the screws to improve tolerances, and this time I wanted to use pipe pieces. When you place a pipe sideways, they don't take up a full block, but closer to 3/4 of a block. That gives me about half a block of tolerance total, and the rounded pieces on the end help keep it aligned. I also made the decision here that for the sake of lag and consistency, I would put the sensor facing out, so that the magnets on the projectile were only active when it was inside the barrel. I ended up going back on this decision, but it's an important change. This one was just a test of the pipe pieces. The shape isn't important, but you can see that it worked extremely well. The pipes allow it to move more freely without getting stuck. Logically, you might think next I would finalize the projectile, since I was most of the way there. But really, I wanted to get the Railgun name up and down, before I even had a finalized gun. Yeah, I wanted to do everything all at once, I guess. I placed down some bearings and welded each side together because I wanted to see if they had enough strength to lift the launcher. As I expected, they didn't, so I moved on to pistons. I was trying to avoid pistons because of how glitchy they can be, but I went with it anyway. At first I wanted to place them at the back of the barrel so it wasn't too obvious, but that didn't work at all. Okay, hello, goodbye. Please come back to me. I actually had to chase it down more than one time. I then tried to put them in the middle, which worked a little better, I guess. This one was just hopping away instead of flying away. I settled for putting them at the front because it was easily the most stable, and in the end I actually think it adds to the industrial aesthetic. I also realized later that this had the benefit of acting like a sight for lighting up shots. Finally, I moved on to the projectile. I started by placing down 2 small explosives followed by 8 magnets. I surrounded these in a shell of pipe pieces to improve tolerances but also to protect all but the front of the explosives. That's actually almost the entire projectile. I do make minor changes later, but all I really do is rotate the sensor and exchange it for a lower level one so it blows up. I tested it at this stage, and although it didn't fly straight, it did explode and work just how I wanted. I wanted it to be able to fire more than one time, so I set to making a magazine. I had a great idea to make a magazine that could work in any orientation. Scrap Mechanic doesn't have a good way to make compressive springs that aren't unstable, so in vanilla, gravity-fed magazines are really the best you can do. But I've got magnets, so I thought, what if I place magnets at the bottom of the magazine, so no matter what orientation it's in, the magnets will pull the projectiles into the chamber. So I made some logic that will pull them down, and once it hits the bottom, it will fire. I won't talk about it in detail, but this didn't work for a number of reasons. While the projectiles would be pulled down, they would also be pulled into each other. That meant the magnets couldn't be on unless the projectile was ready to be fired, which means I need some way to detach the projectiles and turn them on at the same time. That leads to a lot of logic, physics interactions, and overall it was just unnecessarily complicated. I actually did get it mostly working, but at the end I realized something important. If the magazine worked upside down, the projectile would just fall out of the launcher, and I was going to put this on a car that also wouldn't work upside down, so it was pointless from the start. Anyway, an hour later, with projectiles loaded by breaking some cardboard and a gravity-fed magazine, I put it on a simple car. I gave the car tank steering so that it could turn in place for easier aiming, but it was pretty ineffective because of its size, so I assisted it with a suspension glitch. I used an AD into WS converter so that I could control it with my movement keys as well. I gave it some deployable supports so that it wouldn't move while firing, and I also made it so you had to be on the supports to fire and couldn't accidentally shoot while moving. With that, the railgun was pretty much completed, and I went ahead and did some final tests. I think the walls were the most satisfying, but I also tested it on some walks. Nothing. A little bit premature. Oh, that one was a direct hit. Steady, fire. And, oh, perfect. Almost, kind of. It isn't perfect, and sometimes it explodes itself, but when it does work well, it's very satisfying. Aim. And fire. Oh, that was such a good hit. And that's it. I'll show a time lapse of me miserably failing to kill a farm bot with it in the background as I do my outro. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and feel free to subscribe. If you're interested in another video like this, you can click the card on the screen or check out my channel. I think this was a super cool build, and if you remind me I might upload it to the workshop. I was having some issues at the time, but if someone wants it, I can definitely provide. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.